Well, it's been a couple minutes. Looks like our group's a little bit light. We could just get started, and for folks who maybe miss out on kind of the beginning, context, presentation, introductions, all that good stuff, we could point them to we're going to be recording this session just so folks can share it, and we can point them to that. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I'll start by introducing myself. Hey everybody, I think I know most everybody in the room. Sean Edging, housing planner at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. We received a request from Representative Dexter's office and some of the stakeholders that have been kind of participating in some of the policy conversations around House Bill 2889 to get together a kind of just baseline webinar or informational webinar about the bill. I'll talk more specifically about what it is, but it's essentially trying to take a document that is, very long and very technical and try and explain it in plain language and to provide some insight as to where we expect some kind of technical refinements and policy refinements would need to happen to align the bill with the organ housing needs analysis and of course reflect legislative values as they go through that process. Oh yeah. Okay, we're good. Sorry, we have two folks in here, so we had some camera difficulties. But I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I have a brief presentation or not a brief, actually. We have 40 minutes for this presentation to share with you. I'm going to apologize in advance about the dryness of this presentation. We're talking about a very extensive bill. Also going to link include two links in the chat below. These are documents that we've that will help you follow along as we go through the presentation. The first one is just the text of the bill itself. If you need to refer to kind of specific sections or numbers, statutes, that type of thing for bill language. But we also prepared and we distributed, and I'm not sure if everybody on this call received it because it only went to those who accepted the meeting. We also prepared kind of a section by section summary that takes each section and just describes in plain language, what is this section intended to do? And where would we expect kind of different technical refinements and policy refinements? A technical refinement would be, say, for example, something that is, relatively kind of straightforward or technical, doesn't involve the application of values. A policy refinement is much more values oriented. What do we care about and want policy to look like? And we kind of denote those in different colors. So we have that document. You can feel free to follow along. I think it'll be helpful in kind of orienting our conversation. And I'm going to share my screen. Let me see if I can do that. Let's see, should be right there. And you are folks able to see the screen in front of me? Ethan, can you confirm?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Well, then I will get into, let's see if I can start presenting on this. Perfect. Oh, and I don't need well, that's fine. Okay, great. So it should be in full screen. If you're not seeing that, let me know. But
John, we can also see the notes. It's in presenter mode.
Darn it. All right, let's see if I can presenter view. Okay, perfect. All right, so just again, a little bit about this presentation. Really what the intent of this is to kind of provide before kind of, we expect this bill, to be implementing some of the recommendations that are included in the Organ Housing Needs Analysis Recommendations Report. And, before these kind of policy conversations and refinements can really start, we feel it's important that folks have kind of a shared understanding about well, what's in the bill and how do you describe this to somebody who, can't read through just pages and pages of statutory text. So really what we're hoping to do is to provide that summary and also try to provide it in a way that actually connects it with the recommendations themselves, because we know that that's what people are pretty familiar with. And we also wanted to highlight those areas of kind of where we expect, and we wouldn't say this is exhaustive, this is just kind of DLCD's expectations of where we would expect to see different technical refinements, saying oh, the statute doesn't function the way it's intended to, the way it's written, and we would expect that to need refinement with legislative counsel, and areas where we would expect policy conversations to happen, where we articulate, all right, we need to express some type of value about the way policy ought to be set up, and what would we expect, that kind of decision making that needs to happen in the legislative process to occur. So we try to color code these. We do it in both the memorandum as well as in this presentation. You'll see that kind of throughout the presentation as we go through. Just a brief reminder I'm pretty sure most of the folks in this room are at least somewhat familiar with the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis recommendations. So I'm not going to spend too much time describing them. But just as a reminder, there's a total of 8 of them. The first 4 are really connected to the kind of statutes implementing the way we implement Goal 10. That's our statewide land use planning goal related to housing, with the intent to really restructure and focus them on housing production, affordability, and choice. And we also have kind of 2 additional sets of recommendations 2 and 3, that really recognize some of these kind of broader statewide conversations on housing, equity, on funding, the need to, kind of support with, technical capacity and fund housing that the market wouldn't produce, really getting into issues around kind of governance and statewide coordination around the production of housing that are much broader statewide conversations. And to kind of be clear about like what's in this bill and what's not in this bill, is it encompasses a lot of the different kind of recommendations that are pretty technical and kind of related to the implementation of Goal 10, a lot that really connects to the work that we do at the Department of Land Conservation and Development. But there are some of these kind of broader statewide conversations around, say, funding, around, say, like what should governance look like, how should we coordinate state agencies with the shared goal of housing production, that are not going to be reflected, that are not reflected in this bill, but they're reflected in other kind of bills and discussions that are happening in the legislative session. Obviously, this is a huge priority, so we would expect these to kind of continue and, to take shape as the session continues. So just as a, kind of grounding and saying like, what is the big goal of what the bill is trying to do? It's really related to how we implement the statewide land use planning goal, Goal 10, which is an existing process by which we plan for housing. We plan for a sufficiency of land of housing through the housing capacity analysis. And then we plan to implement policies at the local level through our housing production strategies that actually encourage housing production, affordability, and choice. And really the full set of recommendations make kind of changes all throughout the process and how we implement it that really are intended to connect it towards that shared goal of production, affordability, and choice. We'll get into the details, but kind of broadly, it's really not fundamentally changing what the requirements that, say, for example, local governments do when they implement Goal 10 requirements, but are really intended to kind of change the broad parameters or structures to address what we would see, the owner report kind of acknowledges are some shortcomings of the existing Goal 10 program that do not help us achieve our goals in relationship to housing production. Again, I'm going to talk about each one of these kind of specific recommendations in greater detail, but really they're all kind of connected to this existing process around Goal 10 that local governments already implement, specifically cities above 10,000, implement on a regular schedule. For metro cities, that's once every 6 years. For cities outside of the metro, that's once every 8 years. And of course, cities below 10,000 are also able to participate in this process as well. So let's get into the section by section kind of breakdown and summary of each of these. I'll set that up in just a minute, but I do want to take maybe just a brief minute, kind of recognizing I've already been talking a bunch, and this is already we know it's going to be a dry presentation. So I do want to take a minute to kind of pause to ask if, folks have any clarifying questions as we get into this. Also use this as an opportunity to drink some water. All right, great. Well, at the end of this too, we're also, hoping to have as much time as we can to kind of answer questions about like, what does the bill do, that type of thing. Really, I also will reiterate, this is not really intended to be kind of that policy refinements space where we're, saying like, what should policy look like? It's really intended to be more informational. So we're going to be focusing in on kind of clarifying questions, that type of thing. But let's get into it, and we can dive into those questions at the end. All right, as I mentioned, and I pasted this in the chat, I'll paste it one more time just so folks for sure have it. If you want to follow along, we have kind of two documents that you can have open on your computer. One is the actual bill itself, and then the second one is kind of a section by section summary that kind of describes in plain language what these sections do. One note about this presentation is we wanted to organize this presentation by the actual recommendations in the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Report themselves, because we know that that's what most stakeholders are familiar with and not the organization of this bill. One of the kind of downsides of that is as I'm going through this, it jumps between sections, right? So there might be one section talking about, the methodology and another section that's talking about, how it connects to a different statute, right? And it might take a little bit of jumping around. So this document can help kind of orient you to that. And I'll also apologize. These texts are these slides are very text heavy because there aren't a lot of great images to use when you're talking about bill language. So I apologize about that in advance. I know they say you can either read slides or listen to the presenter. I would highly encourage you not to spend as much time reading the slides. Don't worry about that. I'm going to talk about what each one of them does. And of course, this summary is actually the best thing if you want to be reading something. This will describe it in much better detail than these slides will. So that's what I'll plug there. But all right, let's go into recommendation 1.1. So, and we have kind of the text at the top here, basically what this recommendation is in brief, which the first one, as I've always described, is a pretty straightforward one, which is, we were directed to develop recommendations on implementing the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis into state and local planning programs. So recommendation 1.1 is do that. Specifically, what this recommendation is formalize the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis methodology as kind of the standardized statewide source that we use in our kind of goal 10 planning. And so that includes an analysis that's conducted. Section 2 kind of sets that responsibility in the bill. It specifies that Oregon Housing and Community Services is going to conduct this Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, and it consists of kind of 5 major components. The first kind of 2 pieces of that are really the pieces related to recommendation 1.1, and the latter pieces are more related to 1.2, but I'll talk about that later. And we get into what that means in section 3, and essentially it's a methodology. Section 3 articulates the parameters of this methodology. It's an estimate that the agency conducts where they take the state as a whole, they divide it into kind of these different data regions, and they develop 20-year estimates of housing need, taking into account a lot of different factors that we've talked about before. It includes the expected population growth for that region. It includes the estimate of underproduction, the number of housing units we need on the ground today but don't exist, housing for people experiencing homelessness, the effect of second and vacation homes on the kind of availability of housing, because that plays a role in how much housing is actually available on the ground. And then additionally, what section 3 also establishes is an allocation, right? Specifying that the agency will develop an allocation down to cities and counties that take that overall kind of broader 20-year need and provides each jurisdiction kind of a share of that overall need. And that is kind of the what we're using as the basis for kind of our 20-year estimate of housing need. And so what each kind of city and county would receive is essentially a number of units that would be expected over 20 years, right, as based on this methodology, and then income brackets. So these income bins, as specified in the statute, include 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 120, and 120 or above. These are the brackets that there's been some kind of refinement around and consideration of, but ultimately align with a lot of the different funding sources that are used for affordable housing production, and of course also capture market rate production as well. So that's essentially section 3. It articulates what is in the methodology, what are the parameters therein. And then section 7 is saying, all right, you have these timelines by which you must complete these specific milestones, and there's different timelines in there, and these timelines aren't by any means kind of final. We've even prepared a set of timelines expecting a more expedited review. It just kind of depends on implementation, how fast we actually want things to roll out. All right. So in addition to that, right, so that's all the methodology. All right, takes an agency, you're going to do this methodology. Here are the parameters of that methodology. The second piece to establish this as the 20-year, the basis for housing planning is essentially making this the kind of needed housing, the 20-year estimates of housing that we plan for under Goal 10. And there's one statute right now that encompasses that. It's called the Needed Housing Statute. It's ORS 197.303, right? And it essentially specifies that local jurisdictions are going to do their own localized needs projections. And so there's what this bill does is it kind of breaks out that statute into two sections. It has one that's specific to the metro region, and it has one that's specific to cities outside of the metro region. There's a reason for this break. The main reason is that in the kind of recommendations report, we specify, all right, how is this going to work in the metro region where metro regional government has a kind of statutory responsibility to conduct their urban growth management process. They are the ones that have been estimating the 20-year overall need. And part of the recommendations is saying, all right, that kind of responsibility is going to rest at metro regional government. They're going to retain their existing statutory responsibilities. However, they are also going to incorporate all these methodological things that are included in the OHNA: underproduction, housing for people experiencing homelessness, the effect of second and vacation homes, all of those different factors, right? And they'll use that as part of their regional growth management process. So they set the 20-year total for the metro region, and yeah, that's kind of retained there. And because of that, because for cities outside of the metro, they're going to essentially be receiving an allocation. Those statutes don't exactly mesh very well together anymore. So the legislative concept and now the bill breaks out a separate needed housing statute in section 20. I'm sorry, I mixed these up. Section 17 is that separate statute. Section 20 is the one that's applicable to the metro. My apologies there. But section 17 is getting at all right, what does this statute look like for cities outside of the metro? And it largely resembles the existing statute with a few kind of major caveats. The first one is, right, it's responding to that 20-year need, right, that is prescribed by the OHNA. And then also there's also some kind of simplifications that legislative council thought would be appropriate given the kind of change in the regime that's happening here. But what I'll talk about is they might have done a little bit too much simplification because we think that there's actually a need for some technical refinements here. And so you'll see on the left, we have technical refinements, right, on the policy refinements. I'll talk about some of these technical refinements right now. On the non-metro kind of needed housing statute, there's kind of a misunderstanding that this bill has about what exactly needed housing is. I think the Legislative Council assumed that what cities would have is needed housing that is prescribed to them by the state, which is not the case. What cities would be receiving under an Oregon housing needs analysis is a number of housing units that is kind of their share of the 20-year need, and then the affordability thresholds, right? So, what is needed in the 0 to 30 MFI bracket, what is needed in the 30 to 60, 60 to 80, that type of thing, right? But needed housing is more than that. Cities go through this process of determining, all right, what types of housing do we want to build? Where do we want to build housing? The location? What are the characteristics that we want to plan for? And how do we connect that to the demographics of people who live in our communities? We have to do kind of this demographic analysis, right, to see like, of like household size and market dynamics, right, that really influence what types of housing that the city plans for and is there needed housing. The problem is this bill doesn't actually reflect that. It doesn't really reflect that kind of nuanced understanding. So we would need to kind of recommend some refinements to change that. And of course, we also in the report recommend broadening it to include things like accessible housing as a type of needed housing, right? So planning for people with disabilities, right, is an important part of this package. Also, planning for middle housing as a type of needed housing, right, which is something that has been legalized through House Bill 2001. So those are some additional refinements that we would expect to see in that bill. Additionally, in the Metro Needed Housing Statute, let me see, I think this one is, forgetting what that refinement was there. Oh, yeah. Yes, the main problem in the Metro statute is Legislative Council they kind of broke out the cities that are outside of the metro away from that, and they didn't really change the statute in any other meaningful way. And that's not what the OHNA recommends. The OHNA recommends that metro actually incorporates underproduction housing for people experiencing homelessness, the effect of second vacation homes, and that's not currently reflected there. So we would expect that to also need refinement, right? So these are technical refinements about the way the statute works. But we also expect there to be some pretty important policy refinements and conversations about, hey, we have these kind of values that we, on what we think policy should look like in the state of Oregon. And we kind of identify two in this category. The first one is this concept called an equitable distribution of housing. So when the implementing agency conducts the OHNA and does an allocation, they're basing it on kind of three principles that are articulated in statute. One is expected population growth. Another is regional job share, recognizing that we want people to live close to jobs. And then the third one is an equitable distribution of housing. And that is not a technical term because it's pretty much stating we should build it in a manner that increases fair and equitable housing outcomes, which is a very difficult term to define, at least not in an objective way, right? So it articulates values about where we ought to build housing. And we would expect, right, that type of consideration to need some level of kind of articulating, well, what does an equitable distribution of housing mean broadly, right? And then the implementing agency can then kind of articulate and operationalize that and determine, here's what that means in the context of this methodology, right? Additionally, there's another kind of important question. Right now, the bill kind of assumes all of these responsibilities are going to Oregon Housing and Community Services, but we also know there's interest in potentially having some of these responsibilities at the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis, right? And that's a policy question. Who should be responsible for running the numbers, right? And so that is another expected kind of area of policy refinement that we would expect to see as part of this process. All right, so that was recommendation 1.1. I'm wondering, Palmer, do you think it'd be a better idea to pause in between recommendations for questions? Okay, so then I'll take a minute to kind of pause and see if there are any questions on, any clarifying questions about what I've just presented. How are we doing on time?
It's 5:25.
5:25, great. All right, I'm going to continue and I'll be a little bit more economical with my time. All right, so we're going to move to recommendation 1.2. This one is stating to establish production targets and track outcomes, including equity indicators. And essentially the basis for this is also maybe something that seems kind of straightforward, but is not something we actually have currently in statute, which is that we should articulate goals, what we want to achieve over the next however many years in terms of production, and we should track how we're doing in terms of actually meeting those goals. And we should use that information as well as information about what we know on different types of housing outcomes, say for people with disabilities, communities of color, to inform our policies down the line, right? So it's kind of making this iterative evaluation of how we're doing over time as a state and at the individual kind of local jurisdiction level. And there's a few provisions of statute that get at integrating this recommendation into state statute. Sections 4 and 5 are all about, all right, how do we set up kind of the math there? It tasks OHCS with kind of developing these housing production targets, which are essentially kind of 6 or 8 years of your overall 20-year need. And these kind of are essentially the goal that we're striving for, right? This is the amount that we are shooting to achieve over a shorter time frame, right? And section 5 is developing this kind of production dashboard that is intended to be this kind of evaluative tool. In addition to being able to, access all of this information online, for example, it would also include a lot of contextual information about, what does permitting look like in this jurisdiction over the past X number of years? How many affordable housing units have we built? How does this jurisdiction stack up in comparison to, say, the region, or how does it stack up in comparison to, say, peer market typology cities, right? Similar types of cities in terms of their markets. And a lot of this is really just stating this is the tool that we're using to actually track and evaluate outcomes over time. Additionally, in kind of addition to these two provisions, there's section 6, which is it's called in the bill an equity indicator. This is probably not the best term to be using, so maybe that should be changed. But essentially what it is tasking OHCS with doing a kind of statewide housing equity analysis, where they look at all of these kind of different factors that aren't just connected to production, but are related to like housing outcomes for, by race and ethnicity, for people with disabilities, looking at, racial and economic segregation, looking at gentrification and displacement risk, looking at climate resiliency, the accessibility of existing housing stock, all of these different dimensions of housing need that are, not necessarily just a number, but are very important for understanding and contextualizing housing need. And what's important about this is currently local jurisdictions that do housing production strategies have this requirement at the local level. It's called a contextualized housing needs analysis. And what this essentially establishes is kind of a baseline statewide methodology that cities can use off the shelf. They don't have to do this analysis de novo. They can add to it with the things that they care about at the local level, right? So it kind of provides that baseline analysis for everybody, which would, kind of reduce some of the analytical burden that jurisdictions face, right? So that's section 6. And I also want to note, I'm going to jump over here to sections 29 through 33. These are at the end of the bill, essentially, before we reach the conforming amendments. And what these do is they kind of change the existing reporting requirements for cities above 10,000. So they report kind of permitting data, as well as certificate of occupancy data to the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And we propose some changes here that make it a little bit more accurate and track things that we heard as a need from stakeholders, like the number of accessible units that we produce in a calendar year. But they also, in some ways, are intended to kind of make it a little bit easier to remove some of the unnecessary kind of reporting requirements that we have. One of the biggest ones is this development application reporting requirement that's like back from the 90s that doesn't really tell us any useful information. So that's an example of how that's kind of being streamlined a little bit. And additionally, it also kind of pulls in OHCS because they have a lot of data on affordable housing units and kind of takes that burden away from local jurisdictions. It says, all right, OHCS, you're responsible for figuring out how many how many affordable units were built in a city. And then cities can add to that information if they have additional things that wouldn't be captured by OHCS's inventory. So that's the basics of that section. It just improves the reporting requirements so we can better track production. And then section 25 is an important section that we anticipate a lot of policy discussion around, but currently doesn't have all that much. ORS 197.293 is our housing accountability statute. This is what describes, it pretty much just directs DLCD and LCDC, provides us some enforcement tools, and it directs us to kind of do enforcement related to kind of the timely participation in the Goal 10 process and responding to unmet housing need. And that latter term is very squishy. It doesn't actually mean a lot. And right now, what the bill does is essentially connects that to this housing production dashboard, right? So unmet housing need as it connects to this housing production dashboard, and seeing how we're doing on different pieces of progress. What it doesn't include, and this is going to be an important policy discussion, is what is then the a kind of appropriate response thereafter? How do we ensure we build a system that is, fair and effective in prompting kind of meaningful policy responses when we identify that underproduction is happening, right? So I'll move on to these kind of refinements. That accountability is kind of one of these major, what we'd expect to be probably one of the most major policy refinements that's going to take a lot of discussion among different stakeholders and decision-making by legislators to figure out, all right, how do we respond to underproduction when we identify that it's happening? What is the appropriate response from state and local governments to do that? Additionally, I'll also mention while we're here, I mentioned that kind of equity report, right, where we look at all these different dimensions of housing. What the agency ultimately tracks and measures over time is kind of fundamentally a policy choice, right? It articulates our values in terms of what different dimensions of housing need do we want to measure, of course, according to the best available data that we have. So we listed a few examples of things that this analysis could measure, right, that connect to what we know are existing responsibilities of local governments, but there could be other types of, things that we track and measure over time, right? Of course, it has to be, something that we can measure, but it does articulate what we pay attention to. And in addition to this, we also kind of note a few technical refinements. These are relatively small refinements, or actually more like notes. But Section 4 is in relationship to kind of affordable production targets. There's kind of, you'll notice I mentioned that the OHNA includes all these different brackets of incomes, 30 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 120, that type of thing. But when you're articulating a target, like one number that you're going towards, one of the recommendations in the report is to set that at 60%, units that are affordable at 60% MFI or below, not because it's the perfect indicator, but because it's one that when we see the number of units that are subsidized affordable, we know that that is very likely close to the total number of units that were produced that are affordable at 60% or less, that are, at that range. What gets harder when you're getting to 60 to 80, 80 to 120, 120 and above, is the market actually produces some of that. And we don't have any way of measuring whether or not a market rate unit is affordable to 80 to 120. So it's very difficult to track. It'd be very difficult to design kind of a simple number that articulates a goal or target through that type of thing. So that's one minor refinement. Another piece is articulating that, when we talk about the production dashboard, it's not as simple as saying, here's the number and it's a pass or fail. This is a much more comprehensive analysis of like, how are we doing in relationship to our peers, right? And I just wanted to acknowledge that the technical report actually did kind of a prototype of this kind of analysis. So it would need to be refined further, but essentially of how we actually evaluate progress over time. Okay, so I know that was a lot. Again, I'm going to pause for questions really quickly. Some of these are important policy questions. I recognize that, but let's keep questions to kind of clarifying questions. All right.
Sean, I got a question.
Yeah.
How frequently are the production numbers reviewed by the department?
Yeah, how frequently are the production numbers reviewed? That's a good question. So they would be established right at the beginning of a cycle, right? And they would be targets that extend out either 6 years in the metro or 8 years for cities outside of the metro. And they're pretty much reviewed annually, right? We get that permitting data annually. So this production dashboard would be updated periodically. And so kind of at the review stages, we have kind of two major check-ins that are articulated in administrative rule. One is at kind of the midway point, right? So when you're, let's say 4 years after your housing production strategy, we have this kind of midpoint check-in. That would be one of the first places where we kind of look, all right, how are we doing in terms of all of this type of thing? All of this, these production outcomes. Of course, this information would also be published annually, right? We'd be seeing this progress over time. And of course, at the 6 or 8 year mark as well. So that's essentially when the like targets are kind of reviewed, if that makes sense.
And the numbers are going to be the numbers, Sean, are going to be expressed in just actual units. We need 8,322 units. And
yes, yeah. So there are two targets that are articulated in Section 5. One is an overall production, so how many total units are you building? And then another one is affordable units, right? Those affordable at or below 60% MFI.
Right. And there's no further break between, say, 80 to 120 and.
Yeah, because we can't really measure it. We don't know what market rate housing is affordable to, say, for example, on 80 to 120, for example. We don't have any way of measuring that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's move on, because I know we also want to have some time at the end for questions. Let's move on to the emphasized housing production strategies. The basic premise here is, lifting up the housing production strategy where we articulate all the tools, actions, and policies to support housing and making that the central kind of implementing document of Goal 10. This consists of kind of some major pieces that really relate to a few different sections. I'll start with Section 21. The major piece here is saying we have this kind of term that we've implemented in the past that we refer to as efficiency measures. It's a terrible name, but it essentially means these policies that we adopt at the local level to help us grow in and up. And one of the kind of clarifications here, now that we have this housing production strategy that was implemented later, is saying, well, wait a minute, these housing production strategies are also efficiency measures. They're essentially the same thing. And so kind of connecting and marrying those two, Section 21 does that by establishing this section where it acknowledges that housing production strategies are also efficiency measures as in the buildable land statute. So that's one piece. And then section 9 really, and 10 actually, really get at directing DLCD and LCDC with stepping up in our kind of rulemaking process by articulating a lot more kind of off-the-shelf options, both methodological and policy options that really kind of support and promote housing production, affordability, and choice. And these would include a variety of things relating from, you know, ways to streamline permitting or ways to increase housing diversity, and you know, providing a lot of language and tools and, you know, maybe even permit ready plans, that type of thing. And of course, this would be a full-on process that we would engage in the next biennium. And of course, there's some direction there about what the focus is in section 9 and 10. Section 24 is a kind of minor piece that's saying, hey, if you are a city that is conducting one of these housing production strategies and you identify something that would trigger a transportation or economic analysis, a concurrent economic analysis, this would exempt you from doing that, you know, if it's kind of been reviewed and vetted by DLCD. I should mention, and I'll get into some of the refinements, that is very broad, but let me start at the beginning here. I'll start with the kind of policy piece. So what I articulate in sections 9 and 10 is that DLCD and LCDC, we're going to be doing a lot of work in the next biennium to articulate a lot of these, you know, methodological options, policy options that are really intended to support local jurisdictions as they implement Goal 10. And what we focus on is a policy question, right? So, you know, thinking about what specific outcomes we would want to see out of that rulemaking. This is an opportunity to define those broad categories. And there's a bunch of different technical refinements that we would expect to happen through this. Some is related to the actual structure of sections 9 and 10. They don't make total sense to us, so we want to talk with LC about, like, how do we make this clear, clear direction to us. So that's just one minor piece. There's some budget numbers that kind of don't match up with what we would expect things to cost that would need to be fixed. We also need to talk through how the Legislative Council kind of approached efficiency measures in both the Metro as well as in the HPS. In the housing production strategy, it's kind of a mishmash of a lot of different examples and then maybe broader categories, and we think it could be more concise while not really changing any of the substance of it. And then in section 19, we noticed that the buildable land statute, ORS 197.296, kind of assumed that Metro would be adopting efficiency measures through this other document called a housing coordination strategy, which is not what we really intended. There's actually kind of a nuance in the Metro region because Metro, they control the urban growth boundary decision, but they don't control any of the policies that we would consider an efficiency measure. And, you know, our recommendations reflect that, but it's not really reflected in this draft bill. So that we would expect that to need some technical refinement. And then finally, right, with that employment and transportation analysis, right now it's written as kind of like a waiver if a city adopts a housing production strategy, and that is very broad. That's a very broad waiver that we, you know, recognize, like, transportation and employment planning is important. So we should probably narrow that a little bit to have LCDC define scenarios in which you would exempt transportation and employment analyses, right? To prevent, like, triggering a TSP if you're trying to increase housing diversity or, you know, legalize it in a commercial area or something like that, right? So those are the types of situations that we're talking about there. All right, I'm going to move, just for the sake of time and recognizing, you know, we got a couple more slides to go. I'm going to move on to recommendation 1.4, which is really about kind of facilitating, you know, urbanization and UGB amendments where a need is identified, and where, you know, capacity is limiting production. A lot of this work is going to be happening through administrative rule, and that really connects to sections 9 and 10. It's really going to involve kind of a deeper dive for LCDC in providing, you know, a much more straightforward path for identifying need and developing a relatively litigation safe UGB amendment option for cities, and providing more flexibility to pursue things like, you know, UGB land exchanges or pursue urban reserves or, you know, any number of those types of things. We articulate some of those guiding principles in section 10. And it also amends some of the kind of rural and urban reserve statutes, really with the intent to kind of increase their likelihood to be adopted in cities outside of the metro. I don't know why I made this 2 boxes. I think I just had a little bit of an omission there. Sorry about that. But in short, a lot of this work we would expect to be happening in rulemaking. And of course, there's also the kind of concurrent piece of implementing efficiency measures in the housing production strategy, which both kind of increases and prepares land for development and increases production on those lands, but also is an important part of the growth management process. And we propose ways to kind of streamline it by enabling jurisdictions to front load that work rather than all having to adopt it when they adopt their housing capacity analysis. All right, so that's recommendation 1.4. We actually, beyond kind of the policy, the obvious policy of like what is the direction to LCDC and DLCD to kind of streamline the process, that broad direction. There's only kind of a handful of kind of technical refinements. One is on the non-metro buildable land statute. One thing it does is it breaks out the non-metro cities into a distinct buildable land statute that doesn't actually incorporate all the pieces that are necessary for the buildable land statute. So, we recommend like this should probably be refined to largely and substantially reflect what the current buildable land statute looks like, so that way it functions correctly. But also there's some other kind of minor things around rural reserve and urban reserve, like applicability and how the statute functions to ensure it doesn't have any unintended consequences, right? We don't want to lock jurisdictions out of this process, and we don't want to, necessarily like implicate the whole metro urban reserve process at the same time, right? So just making a few adjustments there. That's what we anticipate in relationship to 1.4. Again, I'm gonna, just for the sake of time, continue moving. We'll have time for questions at the end. Recommendation 2.2 is a pretty straightforward one. This is the idea that, currently in the housing production strategy, the administrative rules that we've adopted really kind of lift up this idea that we should be working for housing choice for everybody. We should be planning for all these different dimensions of housing need and ensuring people have meaningful options, right? And we have that expressed through the fair and equitable housing outcomes and, a variety of analysis related to that. But the basic principle here is, hey, this is actually not in statute right now. So let's articulate that this is a goal. We want people to have more meaningful options, and we should reflect that in our implementation and the statutes that we implement. And really what they kind of get at is, ensuring that we're planning for, the needs for, say, people with disabilities, or planning and recognizing the kind of disparate housing outcomes that can happen by different demographic factors, thinking about gentrification and displacement in a critical way, all these different pieces, and incorporating fair housing planning also as part of the implementation of Goal 10 more meaningfully. And so that is the basic principle here. It's actually a pretty simple amendment to statute. It's really kind of encompassed in section 21. And that equity analysis I mentioned earlier in section 6, right, that is conducted as part of the OHNA, something that will help jurisdictions by providing this baseline set of data. So they don't have to do those analyses just de novo. And that is, again, this one's a relatively shorter recommendation given how kind of simple of an idea it is. But the basics that we would expect in terms of policy refinements are kind of really connected back to what I mentioned previously. How do we define an equitable distribution of housing? What are the types of things we should be paying attention to when we're thinking about housing choice for all? What does that mean? What do we think about, and how do we respond to that through our policies? Those are big policy decisions, right? So we would expect that to continue to be a part of the conversation. All right, and I'm almost done, I promise. But we're going to get into recommendation 3.2. I should mention this bill only half implements recommendation 3.2, specifically implements it for the metro region. It does not implement it for the state. We call for both the state and the metro regional government to essentially articulate, we have these housing production strategies that are adopted at the local level. We should have something similar at the state and metro level. We should articulate what are we bringing to the table in terms of policy work, all that type of stuff, resources to encourage the production of needed housing, right? And section 23 is really what establishes this requirement for the metro regional government. It's very similar to a housing production strategy. The main difference is that it's really focused on what the regional tools metro government has, right? They don't necessarily control zoning ordinances, but they do control, like, regional funding strategies, right? For example, or resource sharing, or a variety of number of things that are kind of articulated in the statute that they could include as part of this, and they do it regularly. And we also note in the statute, there are other regional governments, right, like in Central Oregon and elsewhere, that we shouldn't require them to do it, but it's also an option that they can utilize to leverage, say, resources from the state or federal governments, things like that. So it's an option that's available to other regional entities as well, and counties. And again, just mentioning, right, this is only for metro regional government. We also recommended the OHNA Recommendations Report to have something similar for this at the state level. The hard part is that requires a coordinated statewide entity that's focused on housing production, and that doesn't exist yet, right? So those two kind of go hand in hand, and it's not part of this bill because it's, you know, part of that broader statewide conversation on how we structure government. All right, and that, you know, we've reached actually close to the end here. I'll just note there's one kind of set of technical refinement that we'd expect as part of this, which is that the buildable lands statute for Metro, ORS 197.296, it still kind of assumes that Metro adopts efficiency measures, which they don't. And it assumes that it's going to be part of this housing coordination strategy, which it isn't, right? And really the major change of how we implement efficiency measures in the Metro is that the kind of state takes that on through the implementation of the housing production strategy. So that's where we adopt those different policies to increase, you know, housing diversity, support production, increase housing choice, all of those different types of policies. So that should be reflected in statute, which it kind of currently isn't. So that is what we'd expect the technical refinement there. We, you know, there might be policy refinements here, but we haven't seen any particular that have warranted raising. But all right, and with that, we are now on to the full-on Q&A section. And so I'm going to stop share. Palmer, how much time do we have?
We've got technically 11 minutes. I mean, we could go over a little bit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But yeah, let's take it out and get into questions. I'm happy if you guys have questions about specific components of the bill. I know that was a high-level overview. Happy to talk through those. I can also talk through, you know, the functionality of different statutes if you have questions about specific sections.
I've got one for you, Sean.
Yeah.
So you talked about the fact that there are a variety of measures in the dashboard for assessing HPSs and production. There's a question in my mind about the best way to accurately capture the goal of housing everyone. There's great data, like you said, on the number of new homes produced at 60 AMI and below. That's a good proxy for regulated affordable housing production. It doesn't take into account things like rent control, like vouchers, like cash payments that may theoretically exist someday. Is there anything in the existing dashboard that does allow the city to assess itself or the state to assess the performance of the state on that front?
Oh yeah. So and I'll also articulate too the where we have information about like the different affordability thresholds of different housing units. That's going to be that information will be available, right? The kind of disclaimer on that is when you're looking at all the units that are in the 60 to 80 category, right? That might not be every unit that was produced that is in that is actually affordable at that, because there might be market rate units, there might be the rent controlled units or any of the other policies that can lead a housing unit to be affordable at 60 to 80% MFI, right? So it's imperfect data, but it'll be there. But for the purposes of establishing a target, right, because of the measurability at or below 60% MFI, it makes the most sense as kind of the single number for as the barometer for affordable housing.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, Mary.
So where in the bill, if at all, have the accountability and or enforcement measures talked about during the OHNA work sessions shown up?
Yeah. So it isn't in there. So this bill, I believe it was developed kind of in parallel as we were having those conversations, right? And you'll remember in the final report, we heard from kind of the stakeholders that we were getting comments on and all that type of stuff in the process, like, hey, DLCD, you need to address this, right? And so in the final report, we kind of dedicate this entire section talking about how to set up kind of a fair and effective accountability system that is intended to ensure that we're adopting meaningful policies to promote, housing affordability, production, and choice. And, we recognize like, hey, this isn't the final version of this. We would expect this to be, solid policy conversation in the legislative session, but this is what we know from our conversations with and our experience working with local governments just over the years, and through this process. Now, the bill itself didn't, this happened pretty late in the process. So the bill itself was kind of developed before that. And so it didn't actually include any of those provisions because there wasn't a solid or set policy, right? And there kind of still isn't. But so what we acknowledge is like, hey, this is a big area of kind of needed policy refinement if there is going to be an accountability section in this bill and what that looks like, right? And so it's one of the bigger areas of kind of expected policy refinement we would see and we would expect to see as this bill is refined. Does that get at your question?
It does. And you said you are expecting that we might see that as the bill is refined.
Yes.
Have you seen conversations around that? It's a clear expectation kind of thing.
Yes. I think there's been a lot of interest from a lot of the stakeholders that have been talking to us about this for that. I think I should mention. Yeah, and it's important to the bill sponsor too. The only piece that I would mention is our role. We kind of established this accountability section in the OHNA report that we kind of harken back to a lot. Our role as we kind of get through the actual bill development is not to articulate like what should happen, but like how do you actually implement this? What are the technical things you need to know? So just something to keep in mind as we get into this. Where previously in the OHNA process, we were kind of in the lead in the policy chair. Now we're more on the technical side, just as agency folks. So just something to keep in mind.
Sean, not to jump too far out of the House bill, part of the summary, recommends or discusses implementation. What is, or if anything, can you share about the dashboard and maybe those implementation measures? Like how do we jump from from statute to getting this done, and how much has been put into that, and what can you share? What does the machine look like once
what the machine looks like? No, so some of this work, so right, you're setting a system up, and we also know this is happening in the middle of double Dutch jump rope. One of the things, and this is something I think we can share, is we kind of heard this desire to like think, all right, what is the immediate work that we need to do in the next biennium to like set up all these different components, right? OHCS is going to have to be doing a lot of work. Maybe OEA is going to be having to do some work. And then, of course, we're going to be engaging in this very large rulemaking process. And what are the kind of dates and timelines therein to kind of set that up? And then what does implementation look like kind of ongoing as this HNA and HPS cycle kind of continues? And then we actually start developing numbers and start getting an understanding of the implementation over time. I think what we have, and again, we could share this too. We have a lot of documents related to like what we would expect in terms of costs, like how much would we expect rulemaking to cost? We would expect continued investment for local implementation, right? We actually expect in the next biennium, even though we're setting up a lot of these systems, there's still a lot of housing work to do. And so we kind of need funding to continue to do that. And of course, obviously funding things like UGB amendments and UGB land exchanges as well, which is one of the kind of parts of the recommendation as well. That's something that we can share. It's a long budget document, but we have it, and we also have some graphics related to the what we'd expect that timeline to look like to at least set up the system and kind of start that meshing with the double Dutch jump rope.
Here we Representative Dexter's office.
Yeah, and we shared that with Representative Dexter's office. And we're happy to share that with folks on the call. Other questions? Okay.
You want to say how the questions meter?
Yeah. So, and I also recognize like this was a giant, it's a giant, very dense set of presentations where I was talking about all these technical concepts, right, and how they relate to Goal 10 implementation, which is also a very technical topic. So I also want to offer to, if you have kind of questions down the line that you're kind of scratching your head and you're thinking about this, of course, we expect the summary to help a little bit, but we also try to keep that short. So if you have specific questions, please reach out to us. You can always reach me by email. I think most folks on the call should have my email. I sent out the invitation too, so you should have it through that. We are going to follow up on this meeting with a recording of the presentation itself, as well as some of those materials, right? Like, what does that budget document look like? What does the kind of expected timelines, though I think those are in graphic format. And we'll just share that just as like kind of FYI if you want to, dig in and dive into more information on these types of things. But as you go through and as you're thinking about it, if you, have questions about like how things function, please reach out. We'd be happy to chat. But before I guess we kind of wrap things up, I'll pause, if anybody has, any last kind of questions, comments, let's take a moment.
Sean, I just wanted to thank you both for taking some time on the to walk us through this. It's going to be pretty important and a little bit revolutionary in some areas. So yeah, your attention to detail and just making your time available to walk through this is much appreciated.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate you all for listening. I know this is not the most fun presentation, so thank you guys for being here. All right. Well, then I guess with that, we can close this out, and I will talk to you all soon. And yeah, please email me if you have any kind of follow-up questions. All right, take care.